My name is Marcus Holloway. I am 70 years old, and I live in the Myers Park neighborhood of Charlotte, North Carolina. I am the founder of Holloway and Crane Properties, a commercial real estate firm I built from nothing but calloused hands and stubborn hope. And I am still learning how to carry the weight of what my own son did to me. Last month on my 70th birthday, I called my son and asked him to join me for a simple dinner. He told me he was drowning in work. Hours later, sitting alone with a glass of bourbon at the finest steakhouse in uptown Charlotte, I looked across the dining room and saw him. He was laughing, toasting champagne with his wife and her mother. They thought I was just a clueless old man waiting quietly to die. So I walked over to their table and snapped his corporate credit card in half, right on top of the bill. That night, I went home, locked down every asset I owned, and set in motion a plan that would leave the people who betrayed me holding $15 million of debt they could never escape. Before I continue, tell me where in the world you are listening from in the comments below. And if you have ever had to stand up to family who mistook your kindness for weakness, hit that like button and subscribe. Because this story is for you. It began with a telephone ringing in an empty office. It was 6 in the evening on a Tuesday. Not just any Tuesday, my 70th birthday. I sat behind the old walnut desk on the top floor of the Holloway and Crane building, watching the last of the daylight slide off the glass towers of uptown Charlotte, a skyline I had spent 4 decades helping to raise. I picked up the phone and dialed my son, Julian. He was 36 years old, the vice president of my company, and the only family I had left in this world. The line rang 3 times before he answered. In the background, I could hear the faint, deliberate shuffle of papers, the sound of a man performing busyness the way an actor performs grief. "Julian," I said, keeping my voice light. "I know it's late, but I was thinking we could head over to the Ledger House. Get a ribeye, open something decent. It is my 70th after all." A long theatrical sigh traveled down the line. It was the sigh of a teenager asked to take out the trash, not the sigh of a grown man speaking to his father. "Dad, I'm so sorry," he said, his voice soaked in manufactured exhaustion. "I'm absolutely buried." The county planning office kicked back the zoning permits on the Steel Creek project. I'll be staring at blueprints and legal files until midnight. I just can't step away. I leaned back in my chair and felt a hollow ache open in my chest, the quiet disappointment only a parent truly understands. But beneath the ache I felt something else. Pride, misguided, foolish pride. I had built this company from absolute scratch. In the early 1980s, I slept in the cab of a rusted pickup truck for 3 years, eating cold beans from the can, pouring concrete by day, and studying property law by flashlight at night. I built Holloway and Crane so my son would never learn what hunger felt like. If he was working late to protect our legacy, how could I fault him for it? "I understand, son," I said, swallowing the disappointment whole. "The business comes first. Don't burn yourself out. We'll celebrate next week." "Thanks, Dad. You're the best. I'll make it up to you, I promise." "Happy birthday." The line went dead. I sat in the silence for a long time. 70 years old. It is a strange milestone. You expect to be surrounded by noise, by family, by some living testament to the years you have spent. Instead, I had the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sirens of the city below. I decided I was not going to eat a frozen dinner alone on my 70th birthday. I put on my overcoat, rode the private elevator down to the garage, and drove myself into the heart of the city. As I moved through the evening traffic on Tryon Street, my mind drifted back through Julian's childhood. I remembered missing his Little League games because I was in bank lobbies begging loan officers to keep my company alive. I remembered the guilt that gnawed at me every time I boarded a plane for another deal. I overcompensated. I know that now. The new cars, the debt-free education, the executive title handed to him the day he graduated. I wanted to be the generous father, the man who paved a smooth and frictionless road for his boy. I thought I was protecting him. In truth, I had insulated him from the very struggles that build a man's character. And the result was a 36-year-old who could lie to his father effortlessly on his birthday. I thought, too, about his mother. Eleanor had passed 9 years earlier, and I was grateful, in a bitter way, that she was not alive to see what our boy had become. She had been the soft counterweight to my hardness, the one who tempered every stern lesson I tried to teach, with a warmth I did not always know how to offer. When Julian was small, she used to tell me that a child is not a building, that you cannot pour a foundation once and expect it to stand forever, that a person must be tended every single day. I had nodded and gone back to my blueprints. I had believed that providing was the same as parenting. I had believed that if I simply removed every obstacle from his path, love would take care of the rest. Driving through the wet streets of Charlotte on my 70th birthday, I did not yet know how wrong I had been. But I was about to learn. The valet at the Ledger House took my keys with a respectful nod. It was a place where everyone knew my name, a room where I had closed million-dollar deals over dry-aged steaks and quiet handshakes. I walked through the heavy glass doors into the warm, dim light. The air smelled of roasted garlic, seared beef, and old red wine. Soft jazz drifted beneath the low murmur of well-dressed patrons. The maitre approached me at once, smiling warmly. "Mr. Holloway, a very happy birthday to you, sir. Will you be joining the rest of your party?" I stopped in my tracks. "My party?" "Yes, sir," he said, gesturing toward the back of the dining room. "Your son arrived about 30 minutes ago with his guests. We seated them at the center booth, just as he requested." A cold current washed over my entire body. It was not the chill of the evening air. It was the sudden drop in temperature that happens when your reality cracks down the middle. I did not ask him to lead the way. I simply nodded and walked slowly through the dining room, each step heavier than the last. I moved past waiters carrying silver trays, past tables of laughing couples, and then I heard it. A loud, booming laugh. Julian's laugh. I stopped behind a wide, decorative pillar and looked toward the center booth. My son was not buried under zoning permits. He was not staring at blueprints. He was lounging in plush leather, wearing a beautifully tailored suit, looking more relaxed than I had seen him in months. Pressed against his shoulder sat his wife, Vanessa, holding a crystal flute of vintage champagne. And across from them, commanding the table like a queen holding court, sat Rosalind, Vanessa's mother. I stood in the shadow of that pillar longer than I should have, and in the stretched silence of watching them, my whole history with these three people unspooled behind my eyes. I remembered the day Julian married Vanessa, how I had stood at the front of the church with my hand on his shoulder, so proud my chest ached, believing I was watching my son begin a family of his own. I remembered writing the check for their mansion, in full, in cash, because I wanted to give him the start his mother and I never had. I remembered every holiday dinner where Rosalind had made her sharp little comments about my supposed stinginess while eating food I had paid for, and how I had swallowed every one of them for the sake of a peace I now understood had never been real. I had spent years buying quiet from these people, mistaking their silence for affection. Watching them laugh in that booth, I finally understood the exchange rate. They had never loved me. They had tolerated me, the way you tolerate a slow-moving relative you expect to inherit from. Rosalind was a woman who wore too much perfume and carried herself like old money, though she had never worked a day in her life. 3 towering seafood platters crowded the table, piled with fresh oysters, lobster tails, and king crab. 2 bottles of champagne sweated in silver buckets. I watched Rosalind pick a lobster claw clean with meticulous, practiced greed. I had never liked her. From the day Julian married Vanessa, Rosalind had treated my wealth as her own personal lottery ticket. She made her little comments at every holiday dinner, hinting that a truly generous father would buy his son a bigger house, would fund his mother-in-law's trips to Europe, would open his hand a little wider. I always let it pass, choosing family peace over petty squabbles. But watching her laugh now, with her mouth full of food my son's lie had paid for, something in my blood began to simmer. And Vanessa. In my presence, she had always played the demure, respectful daughter-in-law. Now, leaning into Julian's shoulder, her eyes were sharp and calculating and utterly dismissive. I stood in the shadow of that pillar, paralyzed by the sheer audacity of it. My son had looked at his phone, seen his father calling on his 70th birthday, and chosen to lie through his teeth so he could drink champagne with the woman who despised me. "Oh, Julian, you are too good to us," I heard Rosalind say, her voice slicing through the jazz. "This place is magnificent, and on a Tuesday, no less. Only the best for my girls," Julian replied smoothly, raising his glass. "We deserve a break. The office has been exhausting." Vanessa giggled into her drink. "Are you sure your dad won't notice you slipped away? You know how obsessive he gets about his precious schedules." I held my breath, waiting for my son to defend me. Waiting for one syllable of respect for the man who had paid for the suit on his back and the roof over his head. Julian scoffed and rolled his eyes. Please, my dad is a clueless old man. He's so wrapped up in his golf swing and his retirement accounts that he has no idea what happens outside his own office anymore. He swallowed the zoning excuse without a second thought. He is completely out of the loop. The three of them burst into laughter. It was a cruel, mocking sound, and it struck me harder than any physical blow could have. But here is the strange thing. I did not feel sadness. The hollow ache in my chest vanished, and in its place came a burning, razor-edged clarity. I had spent 40 years across the table from corporate sharks, backstabbers, and hostile raiders. I knew what a predator looked like. I had simply never expected to find three of them at one dinner table, feeding on my money and laughing at my expense. I did not turn around. I did not go home to grieve. I stepped out from behind the pillar and walked directly toward their table. The jazz kept playing, but all I could hear was the steady rhythm of my own footsteps on the hardwood. They were about to learn that this clueless old man was the one who had built the cage they were sitting in. I did not rush. A man who has spent 4 decades in commercial real estate knows the value of pacing. You never run toward a crisis, you walk toward it, owning every inch of ground you cross. As I approached, the three of them remained oblivious. Rosalind was holding court, waving an oyster fork through the air, her fingers glittering with diamonds my son's salary had undoubtedly purchased. Vanessa laughed with her head thrown back, and Julian, my own flesh and blood, the boy I had carried on my shoulders through county fairs, sat there with a smug grin, refilling his mother-in-law's glass. I stopped 2 feet from their table and let my shadow fall across the white linen. Julian noticed first. The smile froze on his face. His eyes went wide as if a ghost had risen through the floorboards. The champagne flute tipped in his hand, spilling golden drops onto his cuff. Vanessa followed his gaze, and her laughter cut off so abruptly she might have been gagged. She pressed her back into the leather, eyes darting between me and her husband. Rosalind was the last to understand the party was over. She lowered her fork, mouth still half open, the arrogance in her eyes dissolving into a wide, frightened stare. For 10 long seconds, nobody spoke. The tables around us carried on, laughing and clinking glasses, unaware of the silent storm that had descended on this booth. "Dad," Julian finally whispered. His voice was small, stripped of every ounce of the bravado I had heard just moments before. "What are you doing here?" "It's my 70th birthday, Julian," I said. My voice was calm, steady, and empty of warmth. "I decided to treat myself to a good steak. Since you told me you were buried under a mountain of zoning permits, I assumed I'd be eating alone." Imagine my surprise, finding my hard-working vice president in the middle of the dining room. The lie tumbled out of him before he could think to stop it, the frantic lie of a cornered man. "Dad, wait. It's not what it looks like. We're entertaining a client. Rosalind has a friend, a major architectural consultant. She's helping me pitch preliminary designs for Steel Creek. I was going to present the whole portfolio to you tomorrow morning. I swear we're working." I looked at the table. There were no blueprints, no legal pads, no sketches. There was only a monument of cracked crab legs, empty lobster shells, and half-eaten caviar. "Working," I repeated softly. Vanessa tried to intervene, her voice artificially sweet. "Marcus, please, we just didn't want to bother you on your special day. Julian was handling the heavy lifting so you could relax. Why don't you pull up a chair? Let us buy you a drink to celebrate." I ignored her entirely, because my eyes had found the only piece of paper on that table. Resting on a small silver tray beside Rosalind's plate was the itemized bill. Even from 2 feet away, the bold figure at the bottom was impossible to miss. $3,500. And sitting squarely on top of that receipt, catching the light of the chandelier, was a heavy matte black metal card. The Holloway and Crane corporate credit card. My chest tightened, but not with sadness. It was a deep, visceral anger that dragged me backward through time. Suddenly, I was not standing in a luxury steakhouse. I was 32 years old again, on a freezing November night in 1984, sleeping in the cab of a beaten Ford pickup on a muddy construction site, because I could not afford both rent and payroll for my 3 laborers. I remembered waking up shivering, my hands cracked and bleeding from mixing concrete in the cold. I remembered washing my face in the icy water of a gas station sink before walking into bank after bank, begging loan officers to take a chance on a nobody. I endured a decade of grinding poverty so that the name Holloway would mean something. So my family would never shiver in the dark. And now my son was spending the fruit of that lifelong agony on seafood towers for a woman who despised me, while laughing about how old and clueless I was. I reached out slowly. No one at the table dared to move. I picked up the heavy black card from the silver tray. The cold metal sat weighty in my palm. I looked Julian directly in the eyes. I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The quiet certainty of a man who knows exactly what he has built is more frightening than any shout. "Dad," Julian pleaded, trembling now. "Please, let's step outside and talk. People are starting to stare." He was right. Conversations nearby had hushed. Curious eyes were drifting our way. "You should have been reviewing zoning permits, son," I said softly, gripping the edges of the card with both hands. "You should have been protecting the legacy I handed you on a silver platter." I applied pressure. The titanium resisted for a fraction of a second, then gave way with a sharp, ringing crack. The card snapped cleanly in half. Vanessa gasped. Julian flinched. Rosalind went pale. I dropped the 2 broken pieces onto Rosalind's plate among the empty shells. "Happy birthday to me," I said. "Pay for it yourself, son." I turned and walked out of the restaurant without looking back. Behind me I heard nothing but silence, and that silence followed me all the way home. That night I did not sleep. I sat in my study in Myers Park with a single lamp burning, and I did what I have always done when the world tilts beneath me. I went back to the numbers. A man who lies to his father about a dinner will lie to him about other things, and a company is nothing but 10,000 small honesties stacked on top of each other. At 2 in the morning, I logged into the secure servers of Holloway and Crane, with the master credentials only I possessed, and I began pulling vendor files. The numbers told me a story before I understood what story it was. There is an honesty to a ledger that people do not have. A ledger cannot manufacture exhaustion over the telephone. It cannot roll its eyes and call you clueless. It simply records what happened, dollar by dollar, and if you have the patience to read it, it will tell you everything the human mouths around you are working so hard to hide. I had read 1,000 ledgers in my life. I had learned to trust them more than faces. And this one was whispering something I did not want to hear. By sunrise, I had found the thread. By the end of the week, with the help of the one man in this world I trust completely, I had pulled it until the whole tapestry came apart. That man is Nathaniel Voss. He has been my attorney and general counsel for 28 years, a lean, gray-eyed man who reads contracts the way surgeons read x-rays. I called him into my office on a quiet Thursday morning, laid a stack of invoices on the desk between us, and told him what I suspected. He did not flinch. He simply put on his glasses and started reading. The invoices all came from a single vendor, Aldergate Design Group, a boutique consulting firm that had been billing Holloway and Crane for interior styling, architectural consultation, and environmental pre-assessment on our commercial projects. The invoices were elegant, professional, and completely fraudulent. I had personally walked every one of those project sites. No design consultant had ever set foot on them. Over 14 months, Aldergate Design Group had billed my company just over $800,000 for work that never existed. And every single invoice had been approved by one signature, the vice president, my son. "He relied on your trust, Marcus," Nathaniel said quietly, aligning the pages. "It's the most common vulnerability in family firms. The perpetrator counts on a parent giving their child the benefit of the doubt. They weaponize your love to blind you to the numbers." "Then he forgot how this company was built," I said. "I didn't survive the recession by being blind to numbers. Every dollar that moves through this firm is a dollar I bled for, and no one, not even my own blood, treats my life's work like a personal slush fund. I want to know who owns Aldergate, Nathaniel. I don't care how many corporate veils they've wrapped around it. Get me names." Nathaniel did better than names. Working entirely through legitimate channels, through corporate registry searches, subpoena-ready financial records, and a licensed forensic accountant, he traced Aldergate Design Group to a registration in Delaware. The list principal was a man named Wendell Cross. The name meant nothing to me. I knew every serious player in Carolina real estate, and Wendell Cross was not one of them. Then Nathaniel slid one more page across the desk, and the puzzle slammed together with a violence I felt in my teeth. Wendell Cross was a retired car salesman living in a modest condominium in Wilmington, Delaware. He was also Rosalind's first cousin. My son was not merely paying a fraudulent vendor. He was funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars of my capital directly into his mother-in-law's family. and the money did not sit in Delaware. The moment Holloway and Crane paid Aldergate for its fictitious services, the funds were wired onward into a private trust, and from that trust flowed a river of indulgence. Chartered flights to the Amalfi Coast, custom jewelry, a German sports car, monthly retainers at a luxury spa. Nathaniel read the expenditures aloud in a clinical monotone, and with every line, the picture sharpened. Julian was not a careless executive making administrative errors. He was a systematic thief, bleeding the legacy I built to bankroll the appetites of his wife and her mother. For one fleeting moment, grief washed over me. I saw Julian at 7 years old, running across the front lawn with a baseball glove, desperate to make me proud. I wondered where that boy had gone, and what had hollowed him out and left this greedy stranger in his place. But grief is a luxury, and I could not afford it. It burned away in seconds, consumed by a colder, cleaner fury. I picked up the telephone on my desk. My hand did not shake. "We end this today," I told Nathaniel. "Call your contacts at the FBI field office. I want a criminal referral drafted by tonight. Wire fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy. I will not protect him. Let the law do what the law does." Before my finger touched the first number, Nathaniel reached across the desk and pressed the receiver back into its cradle. In 28 years, he had never once done that. I stared at him. His expression carried a weight I had never seen in all our years together. "Wait," he said. "Before you make that call, there's something else. Something the forensic team found last night when they finished mapping the money." He reached into his briefcase and withdrew a single manila envelope, sealed with a strip of red tape, and set it in front of me as if it were a live explosive. Inside was one page. A wire transfer confirmation for exactly $50,000, sent from the Aldergate account. But this transfer had not gone offshore. It had gone to a private medical practice in an exclusive, discreet building in South Charlotte. I read the recipient's name out loud. Dr. Emmett Colvard, a prominent, highly sought-after private neurologist. Confusion swirled through me like cold smoke. Why would my son wire $50,000 of stolen money to a brain specialist? Was Julian sick? Was Vanessa hiding some medical crisis? Nathaniel shook his head slowly, and when he spoke, his voice dropped to something just above a whisper. "Julian isn't sick, Marcus." The forensic accountant flagged the correspondence attached to that transfer. "It isn't a payment for treatment. It's a bribe. They are paying a doctor to falsify your medical records." The room seemed to empty of oxygen. The embezzlement was only the surface. Beneath it lay something far darker. They were not just stealing my money. They were building a paper version of me, a broken, failing version, and they were paying a man with a medical license to sign his name to it. I stood and walked to the window overlooking the city I had spent 40 years helping to build. For the first time, the towers of glass and steel did not look like accomplishment. They looked like prison bars. "How do we prove intent?" I asked. "A bank transfer is suspicious, but it's circumstantial. Julian could claim he paid for a consultation for a friend. We need the communications. We need proof of what they mean to do." Nathaniel nodded. He told me the forensic firm he retained held a proper license and could obtain the correspondence lawfully through preservation demands and a court-authorized data request, because the accounts in question belonged to the company itself. He brought in a specialist named Silas Marsh, a former federal financial investigator who now consulted for corporations untangling internal fraud. Silas was a quiet, careful man who carried a worn leather satchel and asked very few questions. Over the next 2 days, working entirely within the boundaries of the law and the company's own ownership of its systems, he assembled the record. On the second evening, he mirrored his screen to the monitor on my office wall. 53 messages, 4 attached documents. The subject lines were deliberately dull, labeled as architectural consultations and estate updates, but the contents were devastating. The earliest exchange, 3 months old, had been started by Rosalind. She was coaching Julian on how to approach Dr. Colvard, noting that the man carried a heavy gambling debt and was desperate for quiet money. The messages that followed laid out a chillingly patient negotiation. $50,000 up front, routed through Aldergate, with a promise of $200,000 more once the objective was met. Then Silas opened the first attachment. It was a comprehensive medical dossier. My name, my date of birth, my personal identifiers, all stamped across the top. I read the diagnostic summary in cold horror. It was a flawless fabrication. According to those pages, I had suffered from severe and worsening cognitive decline for more than a year. The report described episodes of memory loss I had never had, aggressive outbursts that had never happened, an inability to manage complex financial matters. Dr. Colvard had used his credentials to formally diagnose me with aggressive early-onset dementia. He had invented brain scan summaries. He had fabricated cognitive test scores, and he had signed the whole obscene document with his official seal. The purpose was unmistakable. In North Carolina, a person can petition a court to declare an adult incompetent and appoint a guardian to control their affairs and their estate. It is a solemn process meant to protect the truly vulnerable. Julian meant to weaponize it. The medical dossier was the cornerstone. With a signed diagnosis from a respected neurologist, he would file a petition, present my supposed decline to a judge, and ask the court to hand him control of my company, my assets, and my life. Then he would move me quietly into a secured memory care facility, where a confused old man's protests would be filed away as symptoms. The most recent message in the chain was 2 days old. It was from Vanessa, confirming she had received the fully executed documents from the doctor. Her words were brief, cold, and glittering with triumph. The trap, she wrote, was perfectly set. They had every reason to celebrate. And there it was. The champagne at the Ledger House had never been about a Tuesday. They had been celebrating me. Celebrating the paperwork that would erase me. Silas laid it all out with the patience of a man who had unwound 100 schemes like this one. He walked me through the flow of the money, the way a doctor walks a patient through an X-ray, pointing to each shadow, naming each fracture. He showed me how the fraudulent invoices had grown bolder over the months, small at first, then enormous, as Julian's confidence swelled and his fear of being caught shrank. He showed me the offshore trust, the layers, the deliberate architecture of concealment. It was competent work, I will give my son that much. He had learned something from me after all. He had simply chosen to aim it at my throat. I read every one of those 53 messages twice. I made myself do it. I made myself sit in that chair and absorb, in their own words, how thoroughly the people I had built my life around had decided I was an obstacle to be removed rather than a father to be loved. There is a particular kind of cold that settles into a man when he reads his own child planning his disappearance in the flat, businesslike language of a transaction. It is not the hot cold of anger. It is the deep cold of finality, the cold of a door closing somewhere far down inside you that you know will never open again. I did not rage. I have learned that rage is a fire that burns the man who holds it. Instead, something in me went very still and very clear, the way the surface of a lake goes glass smooth just before the hardest freeze. I turned to Nathaniel and Silas. "If I call the FBI tonight," I said slowly, "what happens?" "They arrest my son for embezzlement. He posts bond. He hires the best defense attorney his stolen money can buy. The medical fraud becomes a swearing contest between my doctors and his. And Roslyn, who orchestrated all of it, keeps her hands clean because her name is on nothing." I looked at them both. No, I am not going to hand them a fair fight. They think I am a fading old man who cannot see the board anymore. So I am going to show them exactly the man they want to see. And I am going to let their own greed build the gallows. Nathaniel studied me for a long moment. "What are you proposing?" "They want a senile old fool surrendering his empire," I said. "I am going to give him to them, and while they are busy celebrating his weakness, I am going to walk them, one eager step at a time, into a hole so deep they will never climb out." The plan required patience, and it required me to become an actor in my own life. Over the following week, I let the mask slip in small, deliberate ways. In a Monday executive meeting, I fumbled a set of figures I had memorized decades ago, then apologized and pretended to lose my place in my own notes. I asked my longtime assistant, Denise, the same question twice in an afternoon, loudly enough for the floor to hear. I let a contract sit unsigned on my desk for 3 days, and then blamed myself for forgetting it. There is a peculiar loneliness in pretending to be less than you are, in front of the people who are certain you are already nothing. Each morning that week I would arrive before dawn, before Denise, before anyone, and I would sit in the dark of my office and rehearse the small failures I would perform that day, the way an actor runs his lines. A misremembered figure here, a repeated question there. A contract left unsigned. I hated it. Every fumble scraped against 40 years of pride. There is nothing a self-made man guards more fiercely than the sharpness of his own mind. And here I was, dulling it on purpose, letting people I had fed and clothed and educated watch me stumble and feel their contempt harden into confidence. But I reminded myself, every single time, that a fisherman who refuses to let the fish believe it is winning will never land anything. So I let them believe. I let them believe with everything I had. I felt no shame in the performance, because I understood exactly what I was doing. Every stumble was a thread of the net. Silas kept watch on the internal channels, and the reaction was everything I expected. Julian wrote to Rosalind that he no longer even needed Colvard's dossier, because I was proving my own incompetence to the entire executive team for free. Vanessa answered with gleeful little notes, delighted that my supposed collapse was making their takeover effortless. They were so certain the throne stood unguarded that Julian grew careless. He pushed larger Aldergate invoices through with sloppy speed. He stopped covering his tracks. He even discussed on a company line the exact timeline for moving me into a suburban memory care suite. They laughed about how easily they would pack my things, confident I would be too confused to resist. I listened to the recording of that conversation, with a glass of scotch in my hand. The cruelty of their joy was staggering, but it did not wound me anymore. It only hardened the ice in my veins. They believed they had won. They believed they had outsmarted the man who built the whole enterprise from a rusted pickup truck, and they had forgotten the one rule that governs every predator in the corporate jungle. You never reveal your strength until the exact moment you strike. The annual meeting of the board of directors was set for the following Monday. The directors were flying in from across the region, their minds already softened by the rumors of my decline that Julian had so diligently seeded. His tragic speech was rehearsed. The fabricated dossier was printed and signed, ready to be presented as proof that the founder had finally failed. And so I chose that same week to spring the second half of the trap, the half that would turn their greed into a weapon aimed at their own hearts. On a dim Monday morning, I drew the blinds in my office, loosened my tie, and rumpled my jacket so my frame looked frail. I set 2 generic amber prescription bottles on the corner of my desk, positioned where any visitor would see them. At 10 o'clock, I asked Denise to summon the vice president, and I put a slight tremor into my voice as I said it. Julian arrived in under 3 minutes, wearing a mask of practiced concern. His eyes found the pill bottles, then swept over my disheveled state, and for just an instant, a flash of predatory satisfaction crossed his face before he buried it. He approached the desk the way you approach a wounded animal. He asked gently if I was feeling all right. He noted that the office was dark, that I looked tired. I sighed from the bottom of my lungs and sank into my chair, rubbing my temples with trembling fingers. I told him to sit. I told him we needed to talk about the future of the company and the family. He sat forward, vibrating with an eagerness he could not hide, certain I was about to surrender the crown. I gave him glassy, unfocused eyes. I told him the weekend had been hard, that I had spent hours lost in files I no longer understood, that my memory was failing at a frightening pace. I confessed, in a voice of quiet despair, that the weight of the empire had become too heavy for my mind to carry. He told me it was only natural. He said I had worked hard enough, that he was ready to carry the weight for me now. I pulled my hand back and kept the fragile old man alive on my face. Then I opened the top drawer and drew out a thick, professionally bound portfolio and slid it across the desk. I explained that it was a prospectus for a commercial development in the northern suburbs, a prime parcel zoned for high-end retail and luxury residences. The acquisition cost was $15 million, and the projected 5-year return was staggering. It was exactly the kind of deal Holloway and Crane would normally absorb without blinking. But I don't want the company to hold this one, I whispered, leaning close, conspiratorial. I want you to hold it. My mind isn't what it was. Buy it under your own limited liability company. Holloway and Crane will guarantee the capital. Consider it your early inheritance before I step down. He stared at the glossy cover, his eyes widening. He was a thief, but he was not entirely a fool, and I watched greed collide with caution behind his eyes. He asked why I wanted the property held in a separate entity, instead of folded into our corporate portfolio. I had the answer ready. I gave him a sad, defeated smile. Because my faculties are slipping, son. I'm terrified of making a catastrophic error that damages the main company. If you hold this in a separate LLC, it's shielded from any fallout my decline might cause. The company will guarantee the entire $15 million loan. You won't risk a penny of your own. You simply sign as the owner of your new firm, use our corporate backing to secure the credit, and reap the profit when it opens. I framed it as a father protecting his son from his own inevitable downfall. The bait was golden, and I watched it work. In his mind, this was the most profitable week of his life. Next Monday, he would strip me of power at the board meeting and seize an $800 million empire. And now, on top of that, here I was handing him an independent $15 million asset he could use to funnel wealth to Vanessa and Roslyn, entirely outside the reach of our auditors. The temptation drowned whatever caution remained. He closed the portfolio, his face flushed with triumph, and thanked me for my generosity. He promised to handle the acquisition flawlessly and make me proud. I told him weekly to call his attorneys and begin forming the new company, and to work with Nathaniel on the guarantee papers. He floated out of my office, light on his feet, secure in the delusion that he had conquered my entire world. The moment the door latched shut, the frail old man vanished. I sat up straight, smoothed my lapels, and swept the prescription bottles into the wastebasket. The hook was set. What Julian did not know, what he could not have known, was the truth about that northern parcel. Nathaniel and I had spent 2 quiet days preparing it. The land was real, the zoning was real. And buried in the federal environmental record, obscured behind a chain of dormant holding companies I controlled, was the fact that made it lethal. That parcel sat atop a federally designated toxic waste site, a Superfund property carrying tens of millions of dollars in mandatory cleanup liability. Liability that by law travels with whoever holds the deed. The surface paperwork I had arranged made the site appear freshly certified and clean. Only a buyer who ordered his own independent environmental review would ever find the truth. And a greedy man in a hurry never orders his own review. I want to be honest about something, because this story would be a lie without it. When I set that trap, I hoped in some small and stubborn corner of my heart that Julian would fail to take the bait. I hoped he would look at the deal, feel some flicker of suspicion, or, better, some flicker of conscience, and call me to say, "Dad, this doesn't feel right. Let's do it through the company the proper way." I hoped he would give me a reason to stop. A father never fully stops hoping, even when hope has become foolish, even when the evidence is stacked to the ceiling. That is both the most beautiful and the most dangerous thing about loving your children. It is why they are able to hurt us as badly as they do. I left the door open for him to walk back through, right up until the last moment. He did not walk through it. He kicked it off its hinges and ran the other way. Silas's monitoring caught the aftermath within the hour. 20 minutes after Julian left my office, an encrypted call lit up between him, Vanessa, and Roslyn. I listened from my study with a glass of scotch, and it was almost worth every cruel thing they had done, just to hear how completely they misread the board. Julian relayed our conversation breathlessly, painting himself as the brilliant manipulator who had extracted a golden ticket from a decaying fool. He mocked my trembling hands and my supposed confusion with real delight. Vanessa squealed, already calculating how the profits would swell their offshore accounts. But Roslyn was silent for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and calculating and thick with a bottomless greed. She told Julian to stop celebrating and start thinking like a real predator. She warned him that if Holloway and Crane served as the formal guarantor, the board would demand a full review of the transaction, regular audits, and a share of the profits as the price of assuming the risk. Worse, she said, any director who scrutinized the new company might stumble onto Aldergate, onto the embezzled funds, onto everything. She insisted they cut the company out entirely and seize the asset alone, to keep every dollar and expose nothing. Julian, ever the coward, asked how they could possibly secure a $15 million loan without the company's credit behind them. Roslyn laughed, a hard, dismissive sound. She told him he was thinking too small. She reminded him of the wealth they had already siphoned. And she reminded him of the mansion, the sprawling estate I had bought him outright, in cash on his wedding day, a property he owned free and clear. Her plan was breathtaking in its recklessness. Julian would take a large, high-interest mortgage against the unencumbered mansion for the initial liquidity. Then he would use Aldergate itself as the corporate co-guarantor for the balance. Because on paper, fattened by 14 months of fraudulent fees, the shell company looked cash-rich and thriving. Combine the mansion's equity with Aldergate's fabricated strength, and they could fund the acquisition independently, keeping the entire 15 million in hidden equity, entirely beyond my board's sight. It was the financial equivalent of building a skyscraper on quicksand. If anything went wrong with that land, they would be personally responsible for a mountain of inescapable debt. But their arrogance blinded them. Vanessa cheered, Julian praised his mother-in-law's genius, and I sat in my study, listening to their laughter, feeling a chilling satisfaction settle over me. I had offered them a rope, and Rosalind had eagerly tied it into a noose for all three of them. Over the next 48 hours, Silas and Nathaniel watched a flurry of reckless activity. Julian moved with desperate speed, terrified my generosity might evaporate if my mind slipped further. He went to a predatory private lender, the kind that charges brutal interest and asks few questions, and rushed through a mortgage that stripped every ounce of equity from his home. Rosalind finalized the paperwork binding Aldergate as co-guarantor, submitting the shell company's fraudulent statements as proof of solvency. They were moving so fast, so drunk on the scent of unearned fortune, that not one of them ordered an independent environmental assessment of the land they were mortgaging their entire lives to buy. 3 days before the board meeting, Julian signed the closing documents. He became the sole owner of a $15 million poisoned wasteland, and he walked out of that closing, believing he had just secured his fortune. The trap was complete. Now I only had to let them walk into the room. The night before the board meeting, I could not sleep, so I did something I had not done in years. I drove out to the very first parcel of land I ever developed, a modest strip on the south side of the city, now old and unglamorous, dwarfed by everything I built afterward. I parked and sat there in the dark, looking at that plain, honest building, and I let myself remember the man who poured its foundation with his own cracked hands. That man had nothing, no name, no reputation, no safety net, no son to betray him. He had only his word and his willingness to work until his body gave out. And sitting there, I realized that in some strange way, everything I had built since had been an attempt to protect Julian from ever becoming that man, when the truth is that man was the best version of me I ever was. I had feared hardship so much on my son's behalf that I stole from him the one thing that might have made him whole. I drove home a little before dawn, and I was not afraid of what the morning would bring. I was ready for it. Monday morning came gray and heavy, the kind of low Carolina sky that presses down on the city like a held breath. The board of directors gathered in the glass conference room, on the top floor of the Holloway and Crane building. 12 men and women who had watched this company grow for decades. Julian arrived early, radiant with false grief, a slim folder tucked under his arm. Inside it was Dr. Colvard's fabricated dossier. He had come to bury his father. I stood in my private washroom before I walked into that boardroom, and I looked at myself in the mirror for a long moment. 70 years, a face carved by 4 decades of weather and worry and triumph. I thought about the men and women waiting down the hall, most of whom had trusted me for the better part of their careers. And I thought about the son who was about to try to convince them, all, that this face belonged to a man who could no longer be trusted with his own name. I felt no fear. I felt something closer to grief, the clean and final grief you feel at a graveside, when the worst has already happened and all that remains is to lay it properly to rest. Then I straightened my tie, let my shoulders fall into the frail curve I had practiced, and went to bury the version of my son that I had loved, so that justice could deal with the one he had become. I entered last, and I entered as the frail old man they expected, shoulders bowed, steps uncertain. I took my seat at the head of the long table, and let my hands tremble against the polished wood. Julian rose and began to speak. His voice was thick with rehearsed sorrow as he told the board that it grieved him beyond words to raise such a matter, but that his father's health had declined in ways he could no longer, in good conscience, hide. He spoke of memory lapses, of erratic decisions, of his deep and loving concern. And then he opened his folder and laid the medical dossier on the table, sliding copies down its length, asking the directors to review the tragic professional assessment of the founder's mind. I watched 12 faces bend toward the pages. I let the silence stretch until it was almost unbearable. And then I stood up. I did not stand the way a failing man stands. I stood straight, my spine like a plumb line, and when I spoke, the fragile whisper was gone, replaced by the voice that had closed 1,000 deals and faced down 100 hostile rooms. I told the board that the document my son had just distributed was a forgery. I told them it had been purchased for $50,000 of embezzled company money from a neurologist drowning in gambling debt, and I told them I could prove every word of it. The doors at the far end of the room opened. Nathaniel entered first, followed by Silas, followed by two federal agents in dark suits, and behind them, ashen and shaking, Dr. Emmett Colvard himself, who had, when confronted the night before with the full record of his crime, chosen cooperation over prison. Julian's face drained of every color, the folders slipped from his fingers. I have been in that boardroom for thousands of hours over the decades. I have signed acquisitions there worth more than some countries earn in a year. I have talked frightened investors off ledges and stared down men who wanted to take everything I owned. But I have never felt the room the way I felt it in that moment, when I rose from the chair of a broken old man and stood, instead, as myself. I watched the understanding move across faces like a wind moving across a field, the slow dawning realization that they had been about to participate in something monstrous, and that the man they thought was failing had just caught them all at the edge of the cliff. What followed was not a shouting match. It was a slow, methodical dismantling delivered in the calm voice of men reading facts into a record. Nathaniel laid out the Aldergate scheme, the $800,000 in fraudulent invoices, the trail through Wendell Cross to Rosalind's family, the offshore indulgences. One of the federal agents confirmed that a coordinated review had been executed on Aldergate and on the vice president's affairs, and that the bribery of a physician to fabricate a competency diagnosis constituted its own grave set of federal and state offenses. Colvard, weeping quietly in the corner, confirmed that Julian, Vanessa, and Rosalind had commissioned the false report. And then, Nathaniel projected the environmental record of the northern parcel onto the wall. He explained, with surgical precision, that 3 days earlier the vice president had personally purchased a federally designated toxic waste site for $15 million, using a mortgage on his own home and a fraudulent shell company as collateral, and that because he had done so through his own private entity, entirely outside the company, Holloway and Crane bore no share whatsoever of the tens of millions in cleanup liability now attached to that deed. Every dollar of that ruin belonged to Julian alone. I watched my son absorb the totality of it. His knees buckled, and he sank back into his chair, eyes wide with disbelieving horror as he understood at last that every step he had taken for the past month had been anticipated and shaped by the man he thought he was outsmarting. The senile fool he had mocked behind closed doors had walked him, one greedy stride at a time, into a toxic debt he could never escape, and delivered him into federal hands in the same breath. The second agent moved down the length of the table, his footsteps the only sound in that vast, silent room. He stopped behind Julian's chair and asked him, calmly, to stand and put his hands behind his back. The click of the handcuffs was the loudest sound I have ever heard. The board watched in frozen shock as the vice president of Holloway and Crane was arrested for wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. And then the doors burst open one more time. Vanessa and Rosalind swept in, flushed with anticipation, Vanessa actually clutching a chilled bottle of champagne, Rosalind holding the crystal flutes. They had been waiting in the executive lobby for Julian's text, the signal that the board had voted to strip me of my power. They had come to celebrate my funeral. They froze on the threshold. The champagne bottle slipped from Vanessa's manicured hand and shattered on the floor, the expensive liquid spreading around her designer shoes like the wreckage of everything she thought she had won. She stared at the federal agents. She stared at Colvard weeping in the corner. She stared at her husband in handcuffs. And finally, her gaze found me. For a moment standing there, I thought of the first time I had met Vanessa, how sweet she had seemed, how carefully she had complimented my home and asked after my health and laughed at my old real estate stories. I had thought then that my son had chosen well. I had thought I was gaining a daughter. I understand now that I had been reading a performance, and that everything warm she had ever shown me had been reconnaissance. It is a strange grief to mourn a relationship that never actually existed, to realize that the person you thought you knew was a mask, worn by someone who was measuring you for a coffin the entire time. I gave her no mercy. I laid a thick stack of documents on the glass table, with a crack like a gunshot, and told the room that for the past year these two women had conspired with my son to embezzle $800,000 from this company. Rosalind stepped back, shaking her head, insisting it was a misunderstanding, that Julian had forced them into it. I let her lies fall on deaf ears. A second warrant, bearing her name, was already in the agent's hand for her role in orchestrating both the theft and the bribery of a physician. Vanessa had been careful enough to keep her signature off the corporate documents, and so she escaped the handcuffs that morning. But she did not escape the consequences. The predatory lender, notified of the fraudulent guarantees, had already triggered a default. The mansion had been foreclosed upon at dawn. Their joint accounts were frozen to secure the toxic cleanup. She would keep her freedom and lose everything else. Julian slid from his chair and fell to his knees on the boardroom floor. The arrogant heir who had planned to lock his father in a memory ward was crawling toward my shoes now, reaching out with trembling hands, begging through his sobs. He pleaded with me to reverse the transactions, to use the wealth of the company to pay the federal fines, to save his home, to save his wife. He cried out that I was his father, that I had to protect him because he was family. I looked down at him with a detachment so complete it felt like watching a stranger. I told him, quietly, that he had forfeited the right to call me family the moment he conspired to erase my existence. I reminded him of the birthday, of the champagne, of the laughter, of the fabricated urgency, of the way they had all been far too busy to sit and share one meal with an old man. And I told him that he need never worry about rushing through a meal again, because now he and Roslyn would have years of quiet time in a federal facility to sit and eat whatever the cafeteria served. The agents led them out. Roslyn shrieked about her reputation, about her standing in society, and the agent informed her, without heat, that the Bureau was not concerned with her social standing, only with the money she had helped to steal. Vanessa slid down the wall to the floor, realizing at last that the life of endless luxury was over. My private security escorted her from the building, with nothing but the designer clothes on her back. I stood at the tall windows and watched the federal cruisers pull away from the curb, lights turning, carrying off the remnants of what I had once called my family. And then the room was empty, and I was alone with Nathaniel, and the silence was the first clean thing I had breathed in over a year. There is a strange emptiness that follows a battle you have won decisively. For a year I had woken every morning with a single purpose burning in me, a clear enemy, a clear objective, a clear war. And then in the span of a single Monday morning, it was simply over. The enemy was gone. The objective was achieved, and I found myself standing in the wreckage of my own family with nothing left to fight, holding a victory that felt, in those first raw days, almost indistinguishable from a loss. In the weeks that followed, I learned that winning is not the same as healing, and that the two do not always arrive together. I had imagined, in the long months of preparation, that the morning of my victory would feel like triumph. I had pictured myself walking out of that boardroom taller, lighter, vindicated. Instead, I walked out into a hallway that had gone utterly silent, past the stunned faces of employees who did not know whether to congratulate me or console me, and I rode the elevator down alone, and I sat in my car in the garage for a long time before I could make myself drive. Victory, I discovered, does not undo betrayal. It only ends it. The hole my son tore in my life did not close because I had beaten him. If anything, in the quiet after, I could finally feel exactly how large it was. The whispers moved through the financial district the way whispers do. Some called me ruthless. Some called me cold. A man who would send his own son to prison, they said, over money. But money was never the wound, and they did not understand that. The wound was the birthday. The wound was the sound of my own child calling me clueless, while he drank on a card I had bled for. I had not fought to protect my fortune. I had fought to reclaim the right to be treated as a human being by the people I had loved most. I did not celebrate. For a long while, I did not feel much of anything except a great echoing quiet. I would sit in my study in Myers Park in the evenings and find myself thinking not of the boardroom, but of a boy running across a lawn with a baseball glove. And I would wonder, again and again, where I had gone wrong. Because I had gone wrong. That is the part the whispers never mention. I had given Julian everything except the two things that actually build a person, the experience of earning and the expectation of accountability. I had loved him so carelessly that I taught him love was something you could take without ever giving anything back. A father who removes every consequence from his child's path is not protecting that child. He is disabling him. I understand that now at 70, at a cost I would not wish on anyone. So I decided that the rest of my life would be spent teaching the lesson I had learned too late, to people who still had time to use it. I sat down with Nathaniel and rewrote everything. I disinherited Julian fully and irrevocably, not out of spite, but because an inheritance he had tried to steal by declaring me insane was no longer an inheritance, it was a hazard. I restructured the company so that a meaningful share of it passed to the employees who had actually built it beside me, the project managers and estimators and site foremen who had bled for the name Holloway and Crane, while my son was billing the company for dinners. Denise, my assistant of 19 years, who had quietly noticed the pill bottles on my desk and said nothing but watched over me anyway, received enough that she will never again wonder how she will retire. And then I did the thing that finally let me breathe. I established a foundation, funded with a substantial portion of my personal fortune, dedicated to young people with genuine ambition and no safety net beneath them. Not the comfortable, not the connected, the hungry ones, the ones sleeping in the cabs of their trucks, studying by flashlight, walking into bank after bank to be told no. I named it not after myself, but after the version of me that slept on that muddy construction site in 1984 and refused to quit. Every year it will take a handful of them and give them what I never had, not a smooth road, but a fair one. A chance measured by their effort instead of their bloodline. The paperwork took weeks, but I did not rush it, because for the first time in a very long time I was building something instead of defending something, and building has always been where I feel most alive. I chose the board of the foundation carefully. I chose people who had known hardship, not people who had merely read about it. I set the rules myself. No applicant would ever be asked who their parents were, or where they had gone to school, or what connections they could offer. They would be asked only what they intended to build, and what they had already overcome to get as far as they had. It was, I realized, the exact opposite of everything I had accidentally taught my son. Where I had given Julian a fortune, and asked nothing, this foundation would give a chance, and ask everything. I visited a group of them last month, a room full of nervous young men and women, who reminded me so much of my younger self that my throat tightened. One of them, a young woman who had put herself through community college while raising a younger brother, asked me what the single most important thing was that she should know before starting out. I thought for a long moment before I answered. I told her that generosity is a gift, but it must never be mistaken for weakness, not by the people who receive it, and not by the person who gives it. I told her that the people who love you should be able to sit with you at a table and share a meal and want nothing from you but your company, and that anyone who cannot do that simple thing is not owed your empire, no matter what name they were born with. I told her that blood does not guarantee loyalty, and family is never an excuse to tolerate betrayal. And I told her the hardest truth I know, the one it cost me a son to learn. That true love sometimes means letting people fall into the consequences of their own actions, because catching them one more time will only teach them to jump again. She wrote it down, and watching her write it down, I felt something I had not felt in over a year. Not victory, peace. People ask me sometimes, in the careful way people ask hard questions, whether I regret it, whether I would do it again, whether, if I could go back to that phone call on my 70th birthday, I would simply accept the excuse, hang up, and eat my frozen dinner alone, rather than walk into that restaurant and learn the truth. And my answer is always the same. I do not regret learning the truth. The truth was already there, festering, whether I saw it or not. My son's plan to declare me incompetent and seize my life did not begin the night I caught them at dinner. It had been underway for months. The dinner did not create the betrayal. It only lifted the curtain on it. And I would rather stand in the cold light of a painful truth than sit comfortably in the warm dark of a beautiful lie. That, if nothing else, is what 4 decades of building taught me. You cannot fix a crack you refuse to look at. What I do regret is everything that came before. I regret the Little League games and the school plays I traded for bank meetings. I regret believing that a bigger house was the same as a stronger family. I regret teaching my son, without ever meaning to, that he could take and take and take, and never once be asked to give. If there is a father listening to this who still has time, who still has a young child looking up at him, then let my regret be worth something. Give your children your presence, not just your provision. Let them struggle a little. Let them earn a little. Let them fail a little, and feel the weight of it, while the stakes are still small. Because the alternative is to raise a person who will one day sit across a restaurant from you, laughing, and call you clueless, and mean it. I am 70 years old, I am single, and I stand alone in a company I built from a rusted truck and a decade of hunger. I lost my only son to an incurable disease called greed, and there are nights when that loss sits heavy on my chest. A lesser man might have collapsed under the weight of it. A lesser man might have wept for the family he thought he had. But when I stand at these windows now and look out at the skyline I helped to raise, I feel no bitterness and no regret. I removed a spreading rot from my life before it could consume everything I built. And in doing so, I reclaimed something far more valuable than any fortune. I reclaimed my own dignity and the quiet certainty that I will spend my final decades surrounded by people who value me for who I am, not for what they can take. The air in my office finally feels clean. My legacy is secure, not because it is locked in a vault, but because it is finally pointed at something worthy. And I have made peace with the truth that took me a lifetime to learn. You can give a person everything, and still fail to give them the one thing that matters, which is the strength to stand on their own. But it is never too late to stop being someone's safety net. It is never too late to protect your peace. And you owe yourself always the respect that others deny you. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone in your own life, or if you have ever had to find the courage to stand up to family who mistook your kindness for weakness, do me a favor. Hit that like button, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel so these stories can keep finding the people who need them. And tell me in the comments, was I right to let my son fall, or should a father always catch his child no matter the cost? I read every reply. A personal note before you go. I wrote and narrated this story myself, drawing on years of listening to real families, real betrayals, and real second chances. While it is inspired by patterns I have seen play out in countless lives, the characters, names, companies, and events in this story are entirely fictional, and any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or to real businesses, is purely coincidental. This is a work of dramatized storytelling created for reflection and entertainment. My hope is simply that somewhere in Marcus Holloway's journey, you found something true for your own. Thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next story.